Alrighty, folks, we are going to take a break from our multiple part series diving into the DoD Inspector General report, looking at the accreditation process for C3PAOs for some breaking news. Breaking news. Producer Dustin air horns in the background. Breaking news. 1 month after the CMMC program regulation officially went into effect in black and white on the books in the Code of Federal Regulations, we have the official guidance memo instructing the DoD contract workforce how to determine CMMC assessment level requirements in your contracts and the process for potentially waiving CMMC requirements. Long story short, the memo is signed by the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, and the acting DoD CIO. And it essentially says you're not going to be allowed to self-assess at CMMC level 2, and you ain't getting a waiver. And today we're going to talk about why.
Yeah, so in a continuous streak of things that happen after the program goes live, what we get is more solidifying evidence to end speculation, right? We get memos, we get guidance and documents that basically all of these questions that we've been speculating for multiple months, multiple years about now come with an official guidance that you can refer to that says that, hey, all of that hot air that we were spitting before, here it is now on paper coming from 3 different sources, right, that review it for 3 different things, and the speculation technically should end at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, you would think, but this is the guidance memo from the DoD to their contract workforce. And this is put out ahead of the 48 CFR CMMC rule, which is the one that creates and revises the language in the actual contract clauses themselves that shows up in your solicitations and contracts. So this is the bridge between the policy rule and the contract clause rule. So things are falling into place. This is the official guidance memo. And today we're going to talk about how they will determine CMMC assessment requirements and the process for waivers. So let's get into determining CMMC assessment requirements. So the memo itself states the DoD program managers and requiring activities will use the following CMMC level determination guide to identify the appropriate CMMC level for a given contract. CMMC level 1 self-assessment. There are no certification assessments at level 1. This is the appropriate assessment requirement if the planned contract, task order, or delivery order may require the contractor or subcontractors at any tier to process, store, or transmit only federal contract information in its information system. If you only handle FCI at any tier, then the appropriate requirement is CMMC level 1 self-assessment. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple.
Yeah, and what I think most people are going to get tripped up in thinking is that for one contract, I may have only FCI. But does that constitute all my contracts? And I think that that's an ever-glaring theme that we're going to see as we go through and break apart the memo itself.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And those requirements for protecting FCI are not imposed on you by the CMMC program. They are imposed on you by the FAR Contract Clause 52.204-21, which has been in your contracts since 2016. So don't get mad at the CMMC program. It's just asking for you to super double triple affirm that you are meeting those requirements, but you don't have to pass an external assessment. All right, CMMC level 2, the big one, CMMC level 2 self-assessment, the mythical self-assessment of CMMC level 2. According to the memo, this is the minimum assessment requirement for controlled and classified information. It is sufficient only for CUI outside of the National Archives CUI Registry Defense Organizational Index grouping. We're going to talk about what that means in just a second. So if you handle the data types outside of that group, then you can have CMMC level 2 self-assessment as the minimum requirement. However, CMMC level 2 certification, this is the big one, folks. This is the minimum assessment requirement when the planned contract will require the contractor or subcontractors to process, store, or transmit CUI categorized under the National Archives CUI Registry Defense Organizational Index grouping. What does that mean? If you go to the NARA CUI registry and you click on the defense category, it has a group of data types that fall under that index grouping. These are controlled technical information, DoD critical infrastructure security information, naval nuclear propulsion information, privileged safety information, and unclassified controlled nuclear information specific to defense. If you handle any of those types of CUI, then your minimum requirement will be a level 2 certification assessment that is conducted via a C3 PAO.
So a lot of those categories that you mentioned, Jacob, they sound really high speed and they sound like things that are real whiz bang, as we like to refer to. But I remember when bifurcation was really a glimmer of hope and somebody that didn't want to implement security controls. And what I'm seeing out of this list is one particular category that I think that is going to appear a lot for people, and that's control technical information.
Yep, absolutely. So let's talk about CTI, because this is most defense contractors that handle CUI, handle controlled technical information, especially the engineering firms, the manufacturers out there. This is your bread and butter. So what is controlled technical information? If you look in the NARA registry, the definition is controlled technical information is technical information with military or space application that is subject to controls on the access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, or dissemination. And you know that you have it because controlled technical information is to be marked with one of the distribution statements B through F in accordance with Department of Defense Instruction 5230.24. That is an instruction that has existed in one form or another since the 1980s. The CUI program does not create this category of information. It simply gives a standardized name to obligations that have already existed for protecting this data for a long, long time. The reason that it's a category of CUI in the first place is necessarily because it existed before the CUI program. But anyways, if you go into DoD Instruction 5230.24, which just so happened to have been revised very recently, they give examples of what CTI happens to be. So if you're a defense contractor and you deal with any of the following: engineering drawings, configuration management documentation, engineering data and associated lists, standard specifications, technical manuals, reports and orders, blueprints, plans and instructions, computer software and computer software documentation, catalog item identifications, it's going to have a distribution statement B through F on it. It's going to be CTI, and you're going to have to get a CMMC Level 2 certification assessment.
Yeah. So for me, my question that I was thinking about as you were reading through the list is, Jacob, could you name to me like a lot of contracts that you could think of off the top of your head that wouldn't fall under one of these categories?
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
can't.
Yeah.
So
Just double check.
remember, this is Level 2 self-assessment if you are handling the data types outside of that. So if you're handling archaeological information, if you're handling tax information, if you're handling asylee protective information, other categories of CUI, then you could potentially self-assess at level 2. But if you're handling these categories of defense information, if you're handling these types of controlled technical information, you will not be able to do a level 2 self-assessment. So if you were hoping for that and you didn't believe us the many, many times that we've said it on the podcast, at CS2, so on and so forth, in our recap of the rule on our webinar, here it is in black and white in the implementing guidance from the DoD. Level 2 self-assessment is not a thing for most defense contractors because most defense contractors deal with this type of defense data. All right.
Would you think that level 2 self-assessment would practically take not just CIO approval and all the steps you have to go through, but essentially an act of God when it comes to contracting?
I don't even think that it's an ability for you to say that it's like some ability to get it right. Like if you are handling the information, they're not going to let you get a self-assessment. Like that's the minimum requirement. If you're going to handle controlled technical information, they want the assurance that the data protections have been implemented. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about level 3, then we'll talk about the waiver process. So level 3 certification, there's no self-assessment at level 3. This is the minimum assessment requirement. The planned contract will require the contractor or subcontractors to process, store, or transmit CUI that requires enhanced protections provided by NIST SP 800-172. The general criteria of the CUI that would require these enhanced protections are CUI associated with a breakthrough, unique, and or advanced technology, significant aggregation or compilation of CUI in a single information system or IT environment, and ubiquity, when an attack on a single information system or IT environment would result in widespread vulnerability across the DoD. There is lots of interesting information in this section. The Undersecretary for Research and Engineering is really the one that spearheads the decisions and the management around level 3 requirements, certifications, and the bar that you need to pass in order to be told, hey, you're going to need to get this level of certification. So we're probably going to do a whole episode just on the level 3 side of things. There's additional guidance that they're developing. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. This really only affects a pretty small number of companies. And so the big brunt of the takeaway here is that level 2 certification assessment is the norm. Level 2 self-assessment is not a thing. Do not pin your hopes and dreams on level 2 self-assessment. If you are not planning on going through a certification assessment, then you need to reassess your strategy coming up, because you're going to be in a bad situation here in just a couple months.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me the most about this is the CUI associated with breakthrough, unique, or advanced technology. That means if you are working on something that gives us a distinct competitive advantage that none of our adversaries have, more than likely level 3 is going to be applicable to the contract you're working on.
The more high speed and super cool you are, the more likely you're going to have more intense data protection requirements, which makes sense intuitively. And so it is probably more likely that as a result of being level 3, you'll have more leeway for how you're going to bill the cost of cybersecurity. You're going to get reimbursed potentially for the cost of cybersecurity, because all the requirements at CMMC level 3 in NIST SP 800-172 are technically new requirements. So your rates can change, your reimbursements can change. There's a bunch of flexibility that can come with how you're going to account for the costs of those requirements, which are significant. However, for level 2 and level 3, those are pre-existing requirements that have existed for a long, long time. Those are not new requirements, and therefore they are not factored into the cost of CMMC. So for those of you who the level 3 issues, if those matter to you, we'll probably have a separate episode that talks about that specifically, because it's not most people, but it is interesting. You should check it out. It'll be interesting to see the guidance that R&E puts out around how they determine those things. Level 3 is also later on in the phased rollout, so I'm not sure exactly when R&E is planning on doing that. Everybody's got to get through level 2 first anyways, so that's really the big rock. All right, let's talk about waivers. Waivers. Hey, everybody. Remember all those times we told you that waivers aren't really a thing? Let's look at the details about why they aren't really a thing. So the key takeaway from the waiver part of the memo is CMMC waivers are for entire contracts, not for individual contractors or subcontractors. That's really all you got to know. So
Yeah,
all
so you're saying that if I'm a contractor on the contract, right, and there's something that I feel like is not applicable to me, or I don't need that CMMC level 2, if the level 2 is attached to the contract, there's no get out of jail free card for me.
Correct.
I think that's very important to point out.
Right. Once the solicitation goes out, there is no waiver for an individual company to meet the requirements of whatever the assessment level that's specified in the contract. If you want to have variants and waivers for individual requirements, that's up to you to negotiate per the language in DFARS 252, 204, 7008, and 7012. By the time the CMMC assessors show up, they're verifying the baseline that you agreed to in the contract that you may or may not have negotiated changes for in the process of getting that work. Obviously, if you're a subcontractor on the other side of the mega primes, you really don't have much of a leveraged position to be able to negotiate those things. But that's a problem outside of the CMMC program, right? But yeah, so CMMC waivers are for entire contracts, entire classes of solicitations, as we'll talk about here in a moment. So a couple of bullet points here. All waiver requests go through the component chief information officers before they go up to service acquisition executives or component acquisition executives. There are only a handful of these acquisition executives across the DoD. There's not a lot of these people, and they're the ones that are approving waivers for an entire class of acquisition for CMMC level requirements, if you will. So CMMC waivers may be requested for individual procurements or classes of procurements, not individual companies. CMMC waivers do not affect the underlying security requirements in DFAR 7012 or FAR 52-204-21 because CMMC is an assessment program. It is not the thing imposing the requirements on you. So even if there is a contract or solicitation that goes out that doesn't have CMMC requirements in it, you still have the contractual obligation to implement the requirements themselves. So then the memo says, when market research indicates that including a CMMC assessment requirement may impede ability to generate robust competition or delay delivery of mission critical capabilities, the service acquisition executive / component acquisition executive may approve requests to waive CMMC inclusion or waive inclusion of CMMC assessment requirements. So a couple things here. That means that not only are waivers going to be extremely rare because of the process of trying to get them granted and the level at which they are granted for entire classes, but as time goes on and more companies have their CMMC certifications, they are less and less likely to be sought because the ability to have enough people bidding on the work goes up, right? So not only are they rare to begin with, they will become more and more rare as time goes on.
So you're telling me that right now, if I were even to apply for a waiver, it's not going to exclude me from the fact that I have to implement 800-171. And if the waiver is attached to the contract, it doesn't exclude me from implementing 171 controls. And it has to be for the whole contract. It wouldn't specifically be for Jason's defense contracting agent. Yep.
Correct. Yeah. If you're a subcontractor making parts on a program or a weapon system on a major contract, you don't get to negotiate with some service acquisition executive. The primes are not going to like it if you're calling the contract officer. They're certainly not going to like it if you're calling component CIOs. That's just not how the process works.
And if you're seeing the contract and the requirements are in the contract, it's already too late.
By the time the solicitation goes out and the contract is awarded, it's already too late. The decision to have a waiver or not occurs prior to solicitation. But they talk about waivers in specific CMMC levels. So let's go through that real quick.
Okay.
So at CMMC level 1, there are no circumstances likely to warrant approval of requests to waive CMMC level 1 requirements. There you go. So there's no CMMC level 1 waiver. Let's talk about waivers for CMMC level 2 self-assessment, which we already established earlier is going to be basically nobody. There are no circumstances likely to warrant approval of requests to waive CMMC level 2 self-assessment requirements because contractors have pre-existing self-assessment requirements in DFARS 252-204-7019, what was established by the 2020 CMMC rule, the part that tells you that you have to calculate a score and then upload it into SPRS. You're not going to get a waiver for your CMMC level 2 self-assessment on the off chance that you actually are allowed to get away with self-assessment because you're already self-assessing, right? You're already uploading accurate scores, right? So not a big deal, everybody. So what about CMMC level 2 certification? Can that be waived? According to the memo, in rare circumstances, such as when seeking competition from non-traditional DoD sources, waivers may be warranted for CMMC level 2 third-party assessment requirements. Okay. Such waivers are not appropriate for contracts requiring performance by cleared defense contractors. So if you're a CDC, you're not getting a waiver. Approved waivers on a class basis, so for an entire class of acquisitions, must include a planned expiration date and guidance for requiring CMMC certification in subsequent solicitations. So not only are they rare, not only will they become increasingly rare, they are temporary and they do not remove your obligation to implement the requirements to begin with. And subsequent solicitations after that initial one will include the requirements thereafter. So they are extremely temporary. They go on to say, in all such cases, the solicitation must include a requirement to submit alternate protection plans for securing FCI and CUI data. And the alternate protection plans must be evaluated as part of the selection process. So a waiver is not really a waiver. Waivers are very unlikely to happen. Waivers are made as decisions prior to solicitations coming out by people that you probably can't actually talk to.
What this says to me and what this screams to me is that we needed to have this included because we had to have that stipulation in case the one-off happens that we have to go through this. And if we do go through it, we need a temporary solution until we can figure out why it showed up.
Yeah.
But realistically, we want everybody assessed.
Now, to be fair, there is a waiver process, right? They have it. There was no waiver process in 1.0. There is a waiver process in 2.0. Like that is true. Are you getting a waiver? No. No, you're not. That is not a thing. Do not bet on getting a waiver because, as you said before, just because one solicitation has a waiver in it, all the subsequent solicitations on that work will not have a waiver. And if you have any other contracts and work that you do that don't have waivers, then you have to go through and get the assessment anyways. So it is not a long-term solution to your constraints and problems around implementation and certification.
And when you look at the index groupings, like the categorization of the data, those are things that you would typically see associated with clear defense contractors anyway. So it's just not happening.
Yeah. Hey, let's talk about cleared defense contractors a little bit more at CMMC Level 3 certification waivers. So the memo says, in rare circumstances, waivers may be warranted for CMMC Level 3 third-party assessment requirements. Okay. However, such waivers are not appropriate for contracts or work statements requiring access to both unclassified and classified DoD information. So if you're a cleared defense contractor out there, no waiver for you. That's kind of the end of the story there. So like we said at the top, this is the memo that implements the 32 CFR CMMC section 170 regulation, which is the result of the rule that was published in December of 2024. This is the guidance from the DoD undersecretaries to the DoD acquisition workforce, telling them how to determine CMMC levels in contracts and what the waiver process is like in anticipation and preparation for the upcoming 48 CFR CMMC rule, which will have the final text of the contract clauses that show up in solicitations and contracts, which at this point in February is only a few months away, because we anticipate that we're going to see that rule and those final versions of those contract clauses come out and go into effect sometime between June and August. And this is the guidance that they are going to operate with. And like we said, you're not going to be able to self-assess at level 2, and you're not getting a waiver. So do with that information what you will, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week, folks.